Okay, everybody, welcome to this week's lecture on the causes of the Civil War, big ideas and key events. Now, one of the things I want to begin off to say is that historians have spilled much ink discussing, debating, analyzing the various causes of the Civil War and many of the trigger events or the key events that ultimately led to the outbreak of the war, many of which took place in the 1850s. And so what I want to do today is I want to provide for you kind of some of these big ideas, all right? Every historian generally has their own convictions about what caused the war, whether it was slavery or westward expansion of slavery or states' rights or what have you. And so what I want to do today is just to cover some of these larger ideas and just to present to you the various ways in which historians have attempted to answer this question of what caused the Civil War. And so this week we're going to be sort of looking at the big picture, and then next week I'm going to be having you do an online activity where you will look at some primary sources and try to identify for yourselves where you land on this large question. Now, before we move on to the next slide, I want to read to you a quote or two by a gentleman by the name of Kenneth M. Stamp. He has passed away in 2009, and he was the Morrison Professor of American History Emeritus at the University of California, Berkeley. And he did most of his writing or some of his key works on slavery and the Civil War during the 1950s. And I'm going to be reading to you a quote from a book called The Causes of the Civil War, edited by Kenneth Stamp, and he says the following. He says, "If the search for the causes of a great national crisis such as the Civil War is one of the most absorbing historical problems, it is also one of the most exacerbating. The evidence on which the historian bases his interpretations does not come to him neatly evaluated and arranged so that he knows precisely when, where, and how to use it. Rather, the historian himself evaluates his evidence and unites historical occurrences in cause and effect relationships. The historian, for example, makes the link between the slavery controversy or economic sectionalism and the Civil War." In other words, or in a broader sense, what Stamp is getting at is this is a complicated question. There seems to be some very obvious answers to it, but as you dive into it and you come back to the question over and over and over again, you tend to come up with new conclusions. In fact, Stamp goes on to state, "Uncertainty about the war's causes has driven historians back to the sources time and time again, with the result that we have gradually enlarged our knowledge and deepened our understanding of our greatest national crisis." And so with Kenneth Stamp's ideas in mind, let's now go back to some of the larger ideas about what caused the war so that we can try and make sense of it. Okay, so let's move forward. All right, so the question, of course, is what caused the Civil War? Now, the image that you see here, this is an image of another very famous Civil War historian. His name is James McPherson. There are a number of great Civil War historians out there. Eric Foner, you've got Shelby Foote, although not technically a trained historian, but he wrote one of the most, in-depth assessments of the war. And there are a host of others, but James McPherson has written probably the quintessential work on the Civil War, at least one that has been around for quite some time, called The Battle Cry of Freedom. But he states this. When asked, he said, "The Civil War started because of uncompromising differences between the free and slave states over the power of the national government to prohibit slavery in the territories that had not yet become states." Now, stop there. James McPherson, in this sentence, identifies a number of large issues that historians have to grapple with. He starts off by saying it started because of uncompromising differences. Well, what were these differences? Well, there were a number of differences, and perhaps one among them was economic differences, okay? And we'll see that later in this lecture. But he also says these were differences between the free and slave states, right? So we have, on one hand, potentially economic differences that may have resulted or caused the war. You also see here in his answer that there was an issue of slavery, okay, between the free and slave states. And he goes on to state, over the power of the national government to prohibit slavery in the territories that had yet become states. He continues on here and he identifies in two more major causes. One might be westward expansion of slavery, and the other is states' rights. Okay, so you've got a number of causes that he has sort of touched on. Okay, again, economic differences, slavery, and the westward expansion of slavery, and states' rights. There are other potential causes for the war, and that would include things like the preservation of the Union and holding the Union together. Okay, so there are a number of things that McPherson identifies here. He goes on and concludes his statement by saying, when Abraham Lincoln won election in 1860 as the first Republican president on a platform pledging to keep slavery out of the territories, 7 slave states in the Deep South seceded and formed a new nation, the Confederate States of America. Okay, so this is a very broad answer to a very complicated question. And so what I want to do now is I want to take Stamp, take McPherson, and sort of try to break down what these complicated issues were. And so I'm going to present to you 4 big ideas about what caused the war. And ultimately, I'm going to ask you to come down on 1 or 2 of these where you think the conflict came from. Okay, so we're going to begin with perhaps one of the most major causes of the war. I'm sorry for stumbling over the words here, and that's going to be slavery. So without question, in my estimation, slavery is a key contributing factor to the war. I would go on to state that the westward expansion of slavery was a key contributing factor of the war, but indeed, slavery is central to the outbreak of the war. And so we might say, or there is an argument to be made, that the North and South fought the Civil War primarily over the institution of slavery and whether it should continue to exist in the United States. From this perspective, Northerners are perceived as abolitionists, or at least opposed to the power of slaveholders, while Southerners fought primarily to protect their property rights, and this would be the right to own slaves. Okay? Now, one caveat, of course, is that not every person in the North was anti-slavery or an abolitionist, and there is a difference between these two terms. Anti-slavery folks tended to resist the westward expansion or the growth of slavery, but they may have been content, perhaps just publicly content, with allowing slavery to exist where it was. On the other hand, abolitionists, such as John Brown, William Lloyd Garrison, and a host of African Americans, free blacks, including Frederick Douglass, who I'm sure you have heard of before. These are abolitionists. They are ones who want to see slavery come to an end. And for some of these individuals, including William Lloyd Garrison, they want to see immediate abolition. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that, it's Monday, we have slavery, and Tuesday we don't have slavery. Immediatism or immediate abolition is the idea that we need to immediately begin the process of ending the institution of slavery. Okay? So one major argument is that the war is fought over slavery, and some would argue, and I think they make a strong argument, that the westward expansion of slavery is what caused the war. And in fact, many of the trigger events or key events that you will hear this week have to do with the westward expansion of slavery. That is, the institution exists, but it's beginning to move across the American hemisphere. Okay? And I've had multiple discussions with professors as I was going to school over what the issues were, and it's very difficult, at least for me, to argue that the Civil War did not result from issues over slavery. No matter where you land, as far as I'm concerned, you can always tie it back to slavery in some way. Okay? So this is one major argument for the war. But there are others, and historians have made arguments for others. So let's take a look at some of those arguments as well. The next argument that you'll hear, and there is, validity to this argument, and that is the states' rights argument. That is federalism, the sharing of power. And so what you see here is the 10th Amendment, and the 10th Amendment states the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states, respectively, or to the people. Now, a states' rights argument would say that the state has the right to either secede from the Union, or it has the right to hold on to its property, okay? As it states here, it says Southerners went to war, and this is how the argument would go. It says Southerners went to war primarily to protect the broader right of state governments to remain the primary authority for passing and enforcing laws within their borders. In fact, if you think back to the time when we looked at Andrew Jackson's administration, there was a major conflict known as the nullification crisis, where secession was actually threatened by some folks, particularly those in South Carolina, not specifically over the issue of slavery, but because of the issue of a tariff, right? The federal government had implemented a number of tariffs, including what South Carolinians called the Tariff of Abominations, and they wanted to nullify that law. That is, they wanted to make it null and void because the states believed that they could do so. Now, you could also argue, and this is, I believe, true, that for many Southerners, they were afraid of the federal government's power. They believed that the power that the government held to pass things like a tariff, then if they could do that, if they could pass a tariff, then they could also pass laws restricting slavery or abolishing it altogether. And so from this point of view, the issue is not slavery itself, but rather the right of the state to maintain its slaves. Okay, but of course, as I'm sort of pointing out here, you can link it back to slavery. This goes on to state that the right to own slaves was secondary for Southerners to the right to protect their interests against those of the federal government. Okay, we could look at the Constitution and ask, where in the Constitution does the government have the right to abolish slavery? Where in the Constitution does it have the right to pass tariffs, right? And this gets us back to, the Interstate Commerce Clause or the Elastic Clause. But for many Southerners and many folks in the United States, if the Constitution didn't delegate these powers to the government, then those powers belonged to the states. And so the states' rights argument, again, focuses not so much on slavery and protecting slavery, but as it states here, the right to protect their interests. It's the state's right to make their own decisions, okay? And so this argument places states' rights at the center of the conflict, okay? So far we've got two views, slavery and its westward expansion, and you've also got states' rights, okay? Let's take a look at a couple other major ideas here, okay? All right, another major argument, or a argument, is that the war happened due to conflicting economic interests. And as you can see from the images here on the top, we've got something that would tend to underscore the type of economy that had developed in New England and in the North, one based upon the factory system and manufacturing, while at the bottom you see a plantation of cotton. And of course, that underscores the agricultural slave economy of the South. And so the argument here is this. It says the war, or the rupture, between North and South was caused by an inherent conflict between their economic systems. The industrializing North poured its money into manufacturing and internal improvements such as railroads and canals, while the agrarian South still invested primarily in land and slaves. The contrasting laws and cultures needed to sustain each region's growth made divisions between the two groups extremely difficult to reconcile. Now, in some ways, the Northern and Southern economies were connected. Indeed, Southerners grew cotton and sent it north, and Northerners took that raw material and turned it into completed products in their textile factories. Northern banks loaned money to Southern plantation owners to purchase cottonseed and in many ways purchase slaves. So there were some connections between these two economies, but in other ways they were incredibly different. And the idea here is that they were so different that you could not sustain those differences for very long. There was too many varying interests at stake here, and because those interests were so divided, this ultimately brings about the conflict. But once again, we can see that slavery is still a part of this conversation. Okay, it's not absent from this conversation. All right. So we've got, again, slavery and westward expansion of slavery, states' rights, and conflicting economic interests. Okay, so this is another one of those arguments. Let me present to you one final argument that has been made, and then we will briefly take a look at some of the key issues or trigger events, as sometimes they're referred to, which ultimately help to bring out this great conflict. Okay, the final thing that I'm going to present to you today is the idea of the preservation of the Union. Okay, and it says the main priority of most Northerners was not abolishing slavery, but thwarting Southern attempts to secede from the United States. Once again, if we go back to Andrew Jackson and the nullification crisis, one of the things that was being threatened was secession, and Jackson and others argued that the Union must be preserved. It cannot break apart. In fact, when the war erupts, this is Abraham Lincoln's main argument, is that the Union was not broken. It could not be broken, and therefore the United States had not been broken apart. He said, the Union was it was perpetual and it could not be broken apart. And so Lincoln initially goes to war to preserve the Union. Okay, and these issues had presented themselves long before Abraham Lincoln was elected president. Okay, it says supporters of this theory claim that the North believed no state had the right to secede from the nation and would have accepted the continuation of slavery in some form had the South agreed to work within the existing governmental system. In fact, Abraham Lincoln stated in his first inaugural address, that he had no intention of dismantling slavery where it existed, and he did not believe, by his own words, that he had any legal right to do so in the areas where it existed. What Lincoln said he wanted to do was to keep the institution from spreading. But Lincoln states, and he was quite right, that a house divided against itself cannot stand. Lincoln said he did not think that the Union would ever dissolve, but he said it would always become either one thing, free states, or the other, all slave states, right? And that the two sides could not coexist as they were doing. So this, again, is a major argument, and I think for Abraham Lincoln early on, at least, and I say early on because eventually with the Emancipation Proclamation and the allowing of African American troops to fight in the Civil War, the war always was about preserving the Union, but then it became about something else. It became a higher thing, as Lincoln will talk about in his Gettysburg Address, okay? So major issues here, slavery, westward expansion of slavery, states' rights, economic differences and interests, and the preservation of the Union. Now, this may or may not, exhaust all of the potential arguments that could be made, but it definitely touches on some of the key issues. Okay. Now, just to sort of foreshadow for you, next week I'm going to be having you do this online assignment, and when you get to it, you're going to note that the four major topics that I just talked about, those are the four major topics that particular online exercise is going to also be looking at. But just begin to contemplate and think through, okay, which of these arguments sounds the most likely to you, right? Okay. With that, let's now take a look at our final slide. All right, so there are some key events and issues that I just want to make mention of here. These are what some have called trigger events. Some people talk about these as causing the Civil War. Personally, I see each of these as being outgrowths of each of those larger topics that we talked about. So, for example, we can look at the Missouri Compromise. We can look at the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and we can see that there we have definite issues of slavery and its westward expansion. If you're not familiar with what the Kansas-Nebraska Act is, or what the Missouri Compromise is, don't worry. We're going to have some videos for this. But basically, the Missouri Compromise was a compromise made in 1821, where Missouri was brought in as a slave state, Maine was brought in as a free state, and a line was drawn along the 3630 parallel line that said any state north of this line is not open to slavery, and any state below it is open to slavery. The Kansas-Nebraska Act challenged the Missouri Compromise because there were two territories created above that line, Kansas and Nebraska, and instead of saying, no, we're not going to allow slavery there, which is what should have happened if we followed the Missouri Compromise, instead of saying no, those two territories were allowed to engage in something known as popular sovereignty, or the idea that the people of those areas can choose for themselves if they will be slave or not. And eventually, what happens is that issues begin to boil over in Kansas, and there are both pro and anti-slave forces in the state of Kansas, and a whole mess begins to brew over to the point in which a town by the name of Lawrence is burned and sacked, and this will lead to an attack on Potawatomi by an abolitionist by the name of John Brown. And so Kansas becomes known as Bleeding Kansas. These two issues definitely stem back to the larger issue of slavery, but also the westward expansion of slavery, because the issue here is, should slavery be allowed to extend? Okay. On the other hand, you can take a look at the Dred Scott decision, or the Wilmot Proviso, and these things specifically deal with slavery, although the Wilmot Proviso definitely has its hand in the westward expansion of slavery. But the Wilmot Proviso basically said, and this was issued during the Mexican-American War, that any land that the United States would acquire from Mexico should not be allowed to have slavery. Okay, and so here we again see the issue of slavery, and of course the Dred Scott decision, if you're familiar with this, basically said that if you are a slave, it doesn't matter whether you are in a free state or a slave state, you are always a slave. And in fact, the Dred Scott decision null and voided the Missouri Compromise, because of course the Missouri Compromise said, again, if you're in, say, the North, if you're in New York, slavery can't exist there. Well, the Dred Scott decision said if you were a slave in South Carolina and someone took you to New York, you'd still be a slave in New York. Just simply residing in New York or being in the North does not make you free. Okay, and so these, of course, have issues of slavery. If we were to take a look at the tariffs and the nullification crisis, as I've already alluded to, this, of course, gets to issues of states' rights. Okay, and then finally, if you take a look at the 1860 election with Lincoln, Lincoln's, one of his main arguments was the preservation of the Union. Okay, now there's a number of other issues listed here, such as the publication of Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe in 1852, a literary work that highlighted the immorality, the evils of slavery. It was widely read, very, very popular, second only to the Bible during this period of history. And it definitely contributed to the discussion of slavery. And then finally, the straw that broke the camel's back, of course, was the attack upon Fort Sumter in April of 1861, when South Carolina fired upon a Union-held fort known as Fort Sumter, and this will inaugurate the Civil War. Okay, so these are some of those key trigger events. I know your textbook talks more about these events specifically, and we've got a couple videos this week for you to sort of elaborate on these as well. But with all of that said, I want you to begin to just think about what do you think caused this conflict, right? What were the main arguments? What are these main arguments? And which do you agree with? I mean, that's really where I want you to begin to think. Okay? All right, guys, short and sweet this week, but just wanted to kind of give you a broad overview of this discussion, and then sort of let you go off and think about where you stand. All right, guys, as always, go in peace, be warm and filled. May the force be with you. Live long and prosper, and may the odds forever be in your favor.